You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
Okay, students, so between 1618 and 1624, Virginia was transferred from a trading post to a political community. Now, it was hoped that a partially independent community would develop, but no social community was ever established since women were not brought in sufficient numbers until after 1619. And as you're reading, when women finally arrived, the beginnings of a family unit to populate the region appeared, but it never really got off the ground. Sir Edwin Sandys had a particular plan that attempted to create a community in Virginia, but the heavy investment in tobacco encouraged people not to invest in other commodities, and the continued reliance on labor led to the severe exploitation of indentured servants. And the need for more and more land led to the enlargement of existing estates. So with no diversification of production and no agricultural products, starvation and disease became common in Virginia. And relationships with the native confederacy, Powhatan's confederacy, were miscalculated as the native peoples resisted further penetrations into their region. The company itself was disregarded and overlooked by profiteering tobacco merchants, and the idea to make compact communities only led to more outbreaks of disease. In 1619, slaves were introduced and signs of latent racism began to appear. But however, as you're reading, by 1620, a tobacco boom occurred, and the political community was made solvent with the final arrival of profit. And with the boom, the Crown decides to create an import duty on tobacco and sets a ceiling price. And this infuriates the colonists that they begin to sell to the Dutch. And in 1621, the Crown slaps a tobacco contract on the colonists, in effect monopolizing trade with Virginia. And this will be the Crown's response to what happens in the Western Hemisphere with any colony who begins to make profits. By 1622, Powhatan and the Confederacy have had enough of English duplicity. In fact, Powhatan's brother, named Opechancanough, is going to invade or resist the economic expansion of the settlement, and disease and land occupations. They're going to go to war, and they will wipe out anywhere from 1/3 to 2/3 of the population, which proves devastating to the Virginia Company. And a year later, they're going to respond with an extermination campaign that would put the Powhatan Confederacy and the native peoples on the defensive for the rest of the century. By 1624, a writ of quo warranto is going to be implemented, and the Crown is going to replace the Virginia Company with a royal company, and that comes under what is known as a royal control. So historians often ask, how do you explain the inability of Virginia to be unproductive? And after all, the company was booming with tobacco. And the answer they commonly give is the rapaciousness of the planters and the boomtown mentality that was adopted by the colonists as the colonists cashed in their lucrative crop. What does it mean to be rapacious? What does it mean to have a boomtown mentality? Because of the reliance on monocultural production, supplies had to be imported, and sometimes there wasn't enough to start several businesses on their own. Some private enterprise did develop, but basically what developed was the rise of a class of privateers who unconsciously and subconsciously stole and ripped off the system. They created corruption at every level of trade and production. There became a tremendous craving in this society for women and drink. People were always short on goods, so they paid high, mainly in tobacco, for the goods. There was a tremendous need for servants that developed, pushing the trade amongst servants to all-time highs. Historians write about, quote-unquote, the white man's laziness and idleness, and, quote-unquote, the lust for women and liquor. This is the rapaciousness that I referred to above. Now, moreover, the company supplied mostly the officials with tenants. Land and servants were given as pay to officials by the company. George Yeardley and Sir Edwin Sandys made great fortunes, and their success stories, as well as the stories of others of their class, was visible, and their wealth was flaunted. Only those with great labor forces accumulated tremendous wealth, and any attempts to resist or rebel by the servants class were kept in check by brutal punishment. And the most common form of resistance by the indentured was running away. The council that was created was really arbitrary rule by an elite. And in England, the rights of servants were protected by law. But in Virginia, owners were allowed to do what they wanted with their servants. Masters assumed with impunity the right of life and death on their wayward servants. Servitude in Virginia became more degrading than in England. Foreign observers were horrified at how society had become so decrepit. And the Dutch especially wrote how the English trade servants like cattle. So this is the boomtown mentality. This boomtown mentality of get rich quick led to an ugliness that surrounded the community. Private success was not held in check, and the treatment of first servants and then African slaves perpetually grew worse. Now, these are the outer limits of English social expressions, and it reveals the national character of England and how it will develop differently in different environments. In this particular case, it was Virginia. Most often, you are not taught this history in grade school because it would not be nice to show how capitalism is greedy. Now, for the Caribbean, or for Virginia, the economy is going to give way to what is known as monocultural production. For Virginia, it's going to be tobacco, and for the Caribbean, it becomes sugar. So there's a connection between Virginia and the Caribbean. The first settlers in the Caribbean are going to be very exploitative because almost immediately African slaves became part of the labor force in the settlements. Basically, in the islands, there was a tremendous absentee ownership. Spain had already settled Cuba and Haiti, but not the Leeward Islands. And this was due to different kinds of rumors with regards to native resistance. Now, the British are going to eventually, just by chance, land in Barbados as a ship got sunk. It's going to be, Barbados will eventually be developed, and then eventually the British will have interest in the Caribbean. Now, the British favored the Caribbean more than the mainland colonies because the Caribbean provided immediate cash crops such as molasses and sugar. So eventually you're going to see all the different kinds of British isles that will be established. Nevis in 1628, Montserrat and Antigua in 1632, Barbuda in 1636. Then there's Jamaica in 1655. That was captured as a protectorate for all others. But it's Barbados that supplies historians with the most information. But nonetheless, one of the things that most important is that when you take your labor forces from temperate zones and you put them in tropical zones, they have problems adjusting, especially to the work habit. And so what's going to happen is a lot of white workers are not going to be able to survive with excruciating labor conditions in a tropical zone. So they will rebel. And so what the owners will do in the islands, they will replace rebellious white workers with African slaves. And African slaves are coming from tropical zones. They can work and withstand tropical weather. So what's going to happen is a similar pattern that's going to happen in the Caribbean is going to influence what's going to happen in Virginia. So let's take a look at Virginia and Maryland, and let's understand some basic characteristics for each. There are 4 basic features of the Chesapeake society that is going to continue to the end of the 17th century, and this is going to eventually influence the development, or eventually the creation of the South, and what is known as the South of the United States. First was a legislative assembly. The other was the dependence on tobacco or a monocultural economy. And then the continuance of a headright system, and then the mortality rate that continues to be high. Now, the features that we have discussed for Virginia will also characterize Maryland. Although for Maryland, there are some very important differences. Whereas Virginia gained its impetus from merchants and had a clear commercial objective, as you are reading in the chapter, Maryland was founded by a proprietor who received a feudal charter in 1634. Maryland at the outset was less commercial and more religious at the outset because it was supposed to be a refuge for Catholics. The idea was to establish a landed feudal system which was to be dominated by the Catholic landed gentry. Now, the Catholic landed gentry just distrusted Parliament's merchant influence, and Lord Calvert was vehemently anti-Puritan. So the King Charles at the time in England favored Baltimore, and after all, he was married to a Spanish queen. So one of the things that's most important is that the Maryland experience, the influence of Catholicism was important, but Catholics were not the highest population. with the Act Concerning Religion that was adopted in 1649 that you'll be reading, there was religious freedom allowed. But what's happening is that the idea was to ingeniously protect Catholics against Puritans. But nonetheless, what we see in effect is a pattern of lay control in Maryland, in Maryland, a weak religious influence. This was a pattern that was similar to what you're learning and that was occurring in Virginia. Now, there was prosperity for the Chesapeake Society because they found a marketable crop, which became the basis for the region's survival. But tobacco affected society in most significant ways. First, it created a monocultural economy. And when society is organized or arranged around the export of one crop, it becomes totally dependent on the market fluctuations of the crop. So this creates the boom and bust mentality that does not lend itself towards the permanency of social institutions. So short-term fluctuations in the price of the commodity, in this case tobacco, leads to crisis and makes the society vulnerable. The small planter will find it particularly hard to adjust, while the large planter has sufficient resources to weather the storm. Consequently, monocultural production favors the development of an unequal society. And during a period of high prices, equalization occurs because everyone is cashing in on the crops. Everyone is cashing in on the boom. Once the prices drop, though, once a bust occurs, we see intense economic and social dislocation. Now, second, one of the most important things about monocultural production is that tobacco production exhausts the soil. This leads to an agricultural practice of leaving certain lands fallow for a year so that the soil can be replenished with nutrients. And what results from this is the creation of land hunger, which means adjusting policies already established to keep peace with the indigenous. And in other words, what land hunger means is that you introduce extermination policies to wipe out native peoples. This land hunger creates a tendency amongst the prosperous farmers to engross more land. In essence, the rich will expand their land base for future considerations. Most importantly, this land hunger creates a diffuse pattern of settlement. Throughout the century in Virginia, continuing efforts to establish towns will be frustrated because land hunger influenced a dispersed settlement pattern. And then there's the third problem. Monocultural production requires a large labor force. And this required a massive influx of workers, primarily indentured servants. And this need for large labor forces eventually is going to convince the planter class to shift to slave labor, especially as they find out that for profitability to continue, the continual importation of indentured servants is necessary to counterbalance the high death rate of indentured servants. Indentured servants, if you were in England and London and you moved to Virginia, you're going to die, especially with regards to the labor conditions in the fields. Now, once the shift to slave labor occurs, stability in the population rate of labor occurs. Africans are going to be able to survive longer in semi-tropical zones than the European workforce. Now, so who came to the Chesapeake in the 17th century? By 1700, there are 100,000 people in the region, and this number is due entirely to the continuous influx of immigrants. So when we look at a profile of society, some general patterns with regards to sex, sexuality, and marriage help us understand why this region experienced volatility and instability. Now, first of all, the typical resident was a male. In fact, throughout the 17th century, the ratio of men to women would be anywhere from 3-to-1 to 6-to-1. Men were thought to be the better workers, hence they were recruited. In England, men did the agricultural work. Only poor women worked in the fields. Their main economic roles were within the households. They were gardeners, they were textile workers, they were food producers. Only women with power were queens. In England, all property belonged to the male. This was a highly patriarchal experience. Now, this is in stark contrast to women in the Western Hemisphere and those women who are coming from Africa, because women did the agricultural work. In African and Native American societies, women were the possessors of territory. Hence, they maintained some form of political power over the men. When you look at women's situation in England, you can understand why they were less inclined to leave their families for the Western Hemisphere. When we take a look at the first Virginia society, or the 17th century, Virginia in the 17th century, the people were of British extraction. Most of them were from England, Wales, and Scotland. They were exclusively Anglo-Saxon. African slaves do not enter in significant numbers until the 1700s. The population, this white population was extremely young, with most in the 15 to 24 age group. Why 15 to 24? It's because these are people who were in prime physical condition and more physically mobile. The people were predominantly single. Very few came with family, and they tended to remain single because there was hardly any women. 85% of the population in Virginia in the 17th century was indentured. The headright system encouraged people to pay for labor's transport. Now, women who are going to arrive to Virginia are going to arrive as indentured servants. And one of the laws required that women, if they wanted to marry, the husband had to buy up the indenturedness. So most of the people who are arriving in Virginia are from the British lower classes. Minimal artisans came, many workers were the norm, and a disproportionate number came from the cities. And those who had been uprooted and moved to London found themselves locating in Virginia. These peoples who had moved to London were dislocated due to the economic slumps and the Enclosure Acts, where land was confiscated for sheep production in England. What are people doing? They're in search of better opportunities, and the Chesapeake seemed to be the place for these poor whites. But the prospects that poor whites faced as they arrived in Virginia were disease and hunger. The death rate was extremely high. Men lived to their early 40s. Women barely reached their mid-30s. And in England, people survived into their 50s. So tobacco cultivation was extraneous work. And once your indenturedness was fulfilled, the ability to obtain land was controversial. Between 1640 to 1660, with the last of the indigenous resistance movements controlled, continuous economic growth fueled prosperity. So the opportunities to succeed were more favorable and well beyond what England could provide. So if you arrived in Virginia between 1640 to 1660, you were in a boom. Everyone was cashing in. And these opportunities are going to last until about 1680. But somewhere between 1660 to 1680, the Chesapeake is going to be dominated by small planters because you could survive. But after 1660, the economic situation begins to change, and a leveling off of the economic growth will create social and political tensions. And since there were hardly any women, and with a high death rate, we can see why this society is going to remain young, single, and with no kinship. The unequal sex ratio lends some historians to believe that this was a good marriage market for women. And this is what Foner actually is sharing with you in the textbook. However, when you realize that women came as indentured servants and that they couldn't marry until the husband bought off her indenturedness, then there's going to be consequences in the areas of sex, marriage, and family. Now, first, in Virginia, there's going to be a high rate of illegitimacy by the servant class, by servant women. Excuse me. Women in the servant class are going to deliver a high rate of illegitimate births. 40% are going to conceive prior to marriage. 20% will deliver illegitimate births. And there was hardly any free single women. So with the absence of family constraints, we will see a small number of legal marriages. In fact, 1/3 of the women will be pregnant when they marry. Is this a sign of sexual freedom? Basically, the common pattern will be that women will marry late and men will marry even later. And those women who did complete their servitude, they will have a better chance of getting married. But you had to complete your servitude. So when we look at family life, we can see that families were rare. Families were rare in Virginia. Families were short-lived. Families were unstable. And with life expectancy being low because of disease, death many times ended marriages. In fact, many remarriages occurred. So the result that you have, and this is one of the foundations of U.S. society, we have to take a look at why I'm doing Virginia and Massachusetts for the foundations of society. When we take a look at what happened in Virginia, the result is a very complex family system that we can see happening today in urban environments. There's going to be a half-brother here and a half-sister there, along with a stepbrother and a stepsister, a stepfather, a stepmother. Again, this is the family system that's going to lend itself is because of economic exploitation. 1/3 of children in the 17th century are going to lose one parent by the time they reach the age of 18. 1/5 of children are going to lose both parents by the time they reached 18. So the Chesapeake had so many abandoned children that one of the most important institutions became the Orphans Court. And with less parental, less patriarchal authority, people consider this leading to a lessening of sexual morality. And in fact, a much higher percentage of orphaned women got pregnant before marriage than those women who had fathers. So few children were being born as a result of the death rate, and women bore fewer and fewer children. So when we look at the population increase in the Chesapeake, it is entirely due to immigration. So we can discern the following patterns, the following generalizations regarding the status of women in the Chesapeake. Most women came like men, as servants. Most women worked in the tobacco fields. Women were especially vulnerable to disease, especially pregnant women. If a woman got pregnant, there was all the women had to support a pregnant woman because they often succumbed to malaria. And that is a vicious disease to have when you're pregnant, because first the child will take the life of the woman and then the child will die. Now, the absence of family protections led to a society that experienced more extramarital sex than other communities. Is this a sign of sexual freedom, or is it a sign of sexual exploitation? Either way, there was a lot of pressure, sexual pressure on women. If a woman got pregnant before marriage, she was doomed. However, once women freed themselves from servitude, life was better, the marriage market got better, and they were able to influence special arrangements and wills where they were given more than the traditional 1/3. Now, this kind of experience, you can't really teach the children in grade school, because how do you teach children how to be pimps and whores? You can't do that. So it's going to be better when we take a look at Massachusetts. So this is Virginia, and this is the Virginia experience.